Income inequality, as is often pointed out, is greater in the United States than in any other democracy in the developed world. Both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump have in their own ways drawn attention to the growing gap between the rich and the rest. But do Americans care about inequality, or might it actually be a good thing for the economy? Joining me to debate this are Edward Conard, author of the new book, The Upside of Inequality, How Good Intentions Undermine the Middle Class, and a former managing director with the investment firm Bain Capital, and Professor James Galbraith, the director of the University of Texas Inequality Project and the author of Inequality, What Everyone Needs to Know. Thanks, gentlemen, for joining me in the arena. Edward Conard, let me start with you. You think inequality is not a bad thing, which is a pretty contrary view at a time when even major mainstream financial institutions, the IMF, the OECD, the World Economic Forum, they're all sounding the alarm bell about the danger of growing inequality. Why are they wrong?
Well, if you look at the United States, what you see is a deep pool of highly motivated, properly trained talent that's working longer hours, taking more entrepreneurial risks than their counterparts in other countries. They're producing faster growth, higher unemployment, higher median wages. I think that economists haven't put forward a cogent theory. I can put one forward if you like, for why middle and working class wages have growth has slowed while the 1% has continued to soar. Part of the reason for that is in an information-based economy, we no longer need capital to scale up to economy-wide success.
James Galbraith, is the conventional wisdom wrong? Is inequality a good thing, not a bad thing, in economic terms, if not moral terms?
I think that accumulations that are due to technical success are a good thing. I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with them. When they're due to monopolies, when they're due to land rents, when they're due to financial predation, speculation, and so forth, that's another matter. And when they are then used to take over the politics of an otherwise democratic country, that is a very bad thing. And I think that's what we're faced with to a very great extent in the world today, and especially in the United States. I really have no problem with people becoming rich on good business investments, but when their spoiled children become the presidential candidates of major parties, well, then I think that's a problem that I think everybody's aware of at the moment.
Edward, do you want to respond?
Sure. I think that when you look at the evidence as to whether or not the U.S. have an increasing share of crony capitalism, the evidence all works to the contrary. So we should see the U.S. growing more slowly than economies with more equally distributed incomes like Northern Europe, for example, who, by the way, have significantly higher test scores than we do. What we see is quite the opposite. Since the early 1990s, we've been growing faster than those economies. We've created way more employment than those economies have. We've produced way more innovation than those economies.
And James, a lot of the analysis of this election and the rise of Trump, the rise of Sanders, has revolved around this analysis of median incomes, of what's happened to middle America and stagnating wages. How much do you think stagnation in wages, growing inequality, has fueled this anti-establishment mood, this anger that's helped people like Donald Trump get ahead?
Well, I think people are aware that the politics of this country has been taken over by the very rich. That's, I mean, obvious. The last Republican presidential candidate was a partner of Ed's. The present one was a real estate and debt default specialist. So we're looking at that. It's plain as day. I mean, you see the work of the Koch brothers throughout all levels of American government. And I think people are very angry about that, and justifiably so.
Edward, it's undoubtedly the case, says James, that the rich have taken over American politics.
No, I don't think so. I think, look at Donald Trump's a rich guy and Hillary Clinton is. And let's not mistake facts for theories, okay? I think if you really look at the academic research carefully, of which the Freakonomics, Steve Levitt, has reported widely on, I think there's very little evidence that money in politics has had much impact on politics so far. We had seen a lot.
Edward, you're saying academic research. Freakonomics is not an academic paper. Let me quote to you from the American. Let me quote to you from the American political.
Steve Levitt is a very Steve Levitt is a very serious economist.
Let me quote to you
despite the name of his book.
Let me quote to you the American Political Science Association, which did a big study on this not long ago, and they said that in the United States, the less advantaged, quote, speak with a whisper and are unheard by government officials, while the well-advantaged roar with clarity. That's indisputable, isn't it?
Look,
I think it's completely
of course, rich people have certain
the
advantages
Democratic
which
Party
help
at one
them, but
point,
I think we're missing what the main point of the election's about. The rise of Donald Trump is really about the following, which is we take a plant in Indiana and move it to Mexico, and we tell those workers, don't worry, the entrepreneurs are coming, they're going to take risks, they're going to compete with each other, and they're going to drive your wages back to where they were. They see the entrepreneurs move to California and outsource their blue-collar work to China, and they see the skilled engineers who are left behind designing products and factories for Mexican workers. And they say, where are the entrepreneurs who are coming to drive my wages up?
But Edward, they're then voting in droves, or at least have been until now, in the primaries, for a candidate who doesn't want to raise the minimum wage, who wants to cut taxes at the top, who wants to repeal regulation, who's going to basically increase that inequality that's harming them.
You make an assumption, which is we can distribute the money and somehow they're going to end up with higher wages, as opposed to it's going to slow down growth and they're going to end up with lower wages. They look at their counterparts
the IMF says
in
inequality
Europe
slows
and they
down
recognize
growth.
the truth.
James is waiting to come in. James.
Let me come in on this. It used to be the case that the Democratic Party was the party of trade unions and of the civil rights movement and of the consumer movement, the environmental movement, the women's movement, of large, broad-based civilian operations. It's now, I'm speaking of the Democratic Party, let alone the Republican Party, has been for some time a party which gets its funding from Wall Street, from Hollywood, from a small number, from the tech sector, from a small number of very wealthy people. And its policies have been changed by that orientation. I don't think there's any doubt about that. For the Republican Party, this has always been true. The Republican Party's always been the party of business. It has become, in the last generation, the party of very small numbers of extraordinarily wealthy people with very particular lines of entry into the economy. So this is a fact about American politics. I think can be denied by nobody.
But James, you say
Ed makes the point.
But James, you say it can't be denied by anybody, and lots of Americans would agree with you. A lot of polls show that Americans recognize the gap between the rich and poor. They do feel left behind. But when they're asked, do you support redistribution? Do you want to do anything about it? They pretty much say no, according to the polls.
Because they look at the results in Europe and they see where it leads.
When you put the minimum wage on the ballot in this country, even in the reddest states, it passes. Why? Because Americans understand that working people in this country are underpaid. To a very large number of service workers are underpaid, and they need a raise. And they haven't gotten any benefit, basically, from the larger forces of economic recovery. And an increase in the wages that are paid at the bottom of the scale, and a significant one, to $12 or even $15 an hour, would make a huge difference in the social structure of this country, the way politics is done. And it would take low-wage workers off of welfare. It would take them off of food stamps, which is something I think even conservatives would like to see. They don't want to see McDonald's employees having to get food stamps in order to live.
Look at all the serious academic research on minimum wages shows that there's large compositional shifts between workers if you raise the wage. So if you raise it to $15 an hour, there is a very unskilled worker who has a difficult time producing $15 an hour that a customer wants to buy. If you look at the Congressional Budget Office report on raising the minimum wage to $10.10, it cautions that you'll see 3 times as much unemployment among the lowest skilled workers as you will on average as a result of moving it up. Why? Because employers don't hire workers. Customers hire workers. Employers hire workers on behalf of customers. And if you set the bar at $15 an hour and you have a guy that can only produce 9, that guy's out of a job and he'll never get a start. Edward, it's a really bad idea. There's many other ways to help low-skilled workers with things like earned income tax credit.
James, briefly, because I want to bring it back to the politics before we finish. James.
One is that we have a lot of comparative evidence. We have countries in the world that have introduced a minimum wage. The UK introduced a pretty high one recently, and it hasn't produced unemployment. This is not the effect. The people who don't get jobs, there are some. Well, there are things that can be done. Young people should be in school. That's not a bad thing. If their parents are making a living wage, they may not.
What we find when we raise the minimum wage is a lot of them drop out of school to get those jobs.
Edward, you mentioned
the ones that should be.
Just coming back to the politics, Edward, you mentioned earlier that people are, they're upset about, jobs being shipped overseas. They're upset about lack of entrepreneurs. What are they supposed to do about it in a political climate where, as James pointed out earlier, the rich do seem to have taken over? You're disputing that. Just in your own case, in 2012, you gave $1 million to a super PAC associated with the campaign of your friend Mitt Romney. Nothing wrong with that, perfectly legal. But it's hard for the average American to give $1 million to the presidential candidate of their choice, isn't it? And that's only going to increase that problem as the gap between the rich and the rest increases.
Well, that may turn out to be a problem in the future. It's hard for me to speculate
It's
on
a problem
that, but
now.
I would say this.
Right now, there's a growing gap, according to the Census Bureau,
I understand
the IMF,
the question,
etc.
I understand the question, okay? I believe that there are investors who tend to be a small group of people with a lot of money and consumers who are a lot of people with a small amount of money. You can take all the money away from investors, simply give it to consumers, and we will end up with a consumption-oriented, slow-growing, reduced investment economy.
The debate over inequality, regardless of what you think about the facts and the incomes, there is right now a raging debate about inequality, about how bad it is. What's going to happen to that debate under a President Clinton or a President Trump? How serious, how severe is it going to get going forward, do you think, in both of your views, before we finish?
Well, I would argue that it's going to continue to be serious. It's going to continue to be serious until the underlying questions are addressed. And those questions are the wage level in the United States and the role of money in politics. We deal with those two issues, then I think we can be basically a bit tolerant when people acquire great wealth, so long as they do what Americans have done for the last century and more in this country when they do acquire great wealth, which is eventually to pass it on to nonprofits, universities, churches, hospitals, foundations, and bring it back to the service of the community. If we continue to create political dynasties with it, then we will be heading toward, first of all, a decay of the republic and ultimately a kind of political turmoil that we haven't seen before.
Edward, last word.
We have government spending is at 36% of GDP, an all-time high for this point in the economic cycle. The Congressional Budget Office projects it's going to rise 9 points over the next 30 years. That's state, local, and federal combined at 36%, but 9 points from baby boomers are trying to 35. And we have Hillary Clinton out there winning the election, wanting to increase spending another $165 billion a year. At this point in time, their strategy of the Democratic Party is more spending no matter what the spending level is. So are they always going to try to blame the slow growth of the middle class? Are they going to blame the 1% for the slow growth of the middle class and suggest that we can tax them more heavily without slowing growth, without reducing employment, without having any impact on wages? Of course, they're always going to make that argument, but you shouldn't be fooled by it.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for taking time out to join me in the arena. That's our show. UpFront will be back next week.